What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions of The Age of Decadence, the next title up on my list of reviews, and a much requested one at that. As I cover a lot of isometric CRPGs, Age of Decadence is one of those games that you'll hear about on the periphery, as it has a bit of a cult classic status almost. And as such, while I hadn't actually played the title before, it's a game that I had heard a lot about prior to this. Though this is my first actual outing with the title myself, but I'm looking forward to actually diving into it further, because after a bit of initial experience with the game, probably my general first impression, honestly, is that it is surprisingly reminiscent of Fallout 1 and 2. In terms of its UI and its sort of character creation. It's not a one-for-one of the special system. However, it's very similar to that. We don't really get traits, and the combat skills and the civil skills are in two separate trees, but the fundamentals of it is very, very similar. And then we look at the UI, which again is just very reminiscent of Fallout 1 and 2, that is. However, the actual setting and everything of Age of Decadence is quite a bit different, as this game takes place in a sort of low magic reimagining of the Roman Empire. However, apparently it's post-apocalypse. Now, in terms of story, I don't know that much about it yet, because the story itself is non-linear, and moreover, if you want to see everything, which is the entire crux of my reviews after 100%, you have to play through it many times. I think I'm looking at like 8 playthroughs or something like that, because there are guilds to join and just ways through the game that lock you out of other methods of approaching the game. Which is a good place to mention that, in line with what I had heard about the title, it is a game that very much so prioritizes the role-playing as opposed to things like combat. You are not meant to be a super strong soldier who could kill hundreds of men, and basically anything you come up against poses a real threat. In fact, you can play through the game as a pacifist and not fight anything the entire time. But when it comes to builds, the game itself strongly encourages you to either go with a very specific combat-oriented build or a more charismatic build, kind of lean into one thing, as hybrid builds between combat and civil don't tend to do as well. And in many cases, the advice is to just straight up avoid combat. But the combat itself, again, very reminiscent of early Fallout, turn-based tactical system, action points, pretty part and parcel for these early CRPGs, very familiar combat system for me, which is one of the reasons I'm feeling pretty good about approaching this as is. But then, of course, we get to the actual gameplay. Now, this is an older title, but even so, it was pretty dated when it released in terms of visuals. This released back in 2015, which, to be clear, is like right when The Witcher 3 dropped, which is in some ways the reason it's a bit of a cult classic is because of its sort of no-cut corners approach to being a CRPG. But of course, the flip side of that is that a lot of people don't like that sort of clunkiness that a lot of that tends to bring with it, especially seeing how a lot of modern CRPGs have actually tried to do away with a lot of these things successfully in some cases. However, the Age of Decadence still nonetheless is definitely a very robust RPG, and you can tell that just from your initial experiences with the game. You can pick a background which will sort of set up the opening scene for you and kind of determine some stats if you don't want to allocate them yourself. And almost immediately you get dumped into this small town where you start negotiating guilds to join, people to help, things to see. And again, they don't give you a ton of motivation in terms of the story, so I'm curious how that's going to come along. And I would say first impressions wise, just to wrap this up and save some things for the review, I'm very curious to see the full extent of the story, because right now here at the beginning they don't really do anything to like hook you into what you're supposed to be doing, what the motivation is. So I'm very curious to see how that part of it develops across the gameplay as I run through all of it. And then the second thing is I want to see how the builds hold up. As I'm told, it's kind of possible to back yourself into a corner where you lose a lot of progress because you essentially made a build that wasn't viable. And I'm curious to see just kind of how that pans out across the entire game. But that's just about everything I've got for you guys today. I fully expect actually properly reviewing this game to take me probably in the ballpark of 2 weeks, give or take, as again, I have to do like 8 playthroughs of this thing. That said, each individual playthrough, it's my understanding, is relatively short, like 10 to 20 hours. So we'll see, but my initial impressions of the game are actually pretty positive. A little more reminiscent of Fallout than I was expecting. That kind of caught caught me off guard in terms of, again, the UI and the actual character generation, but definitely a very clear emphasis on choice and role-playing, which is always a plus for me. But with all of that said, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but may you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.